Now on BBC Two, Bookmark explores the cult classics of author Richard Allen, whose powerful work, including the violent story of a gang of hooligans, Skinhead, has been given a new lease of life.
Skinheads were Martins, Martins were skinheads. Dr. Martens went hand in hand with their image. 22 Islet Cherry Reds, a bit of a acquired taste, as I would say. There's not many people can actually wear them because they're shaped for the calf. They don't actually make these anymore, so they're sort of collector's items. These are for your sort of more extreme skinheads. Some would say fascists, but not necessarily. Steel toe caps, commando soles. You wouldn't argue with someone who's got a pair of those on, put it that way. Of course, they've got to be laced up the right way, balled up again, nice shine on them. You've got these cherry red ones, do them in black as well. Usually had a pair of each in their wardrobe. Beautiful quality, lovely leather. That's the good thing about a skinhead, you'd never see them with dirty shoes.
Wonderful BBC, another hour of music. Wow, 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 wow.
Joe Hawkins hated his parents with all the violence in his young body. Especially he loathed his father's attitude to life. What, he asked himself, had his dad gained from being a soft touch? The house they lived in was far removed from a palace. It was small, cramped, in an awful street. The neighbours were old, foul-mouthed and unintelligent. Not that Joe felt that he possessed a good measure of intelligence. He admitted, but only to himself, that his education had suffered badly. But he was foxy clever. He had a native intelligence that would carry him to heights his father had not inspired to reach. Plasto and its dirt were not for Joe. One day he would move away and never return. His sights were set on a plush flat somewhere near the West End. But that required money and social position, and as yet he had neither. Although his day was coming. Of that, he was positive. Opening the wardrobe, he selected his gear from its shadowy recesses. Union shirt, collarless and identical to thousands of others worn by his kind throughout the country. Army trousers and braces, and boots. The boots were the most important item. His were genuine army disposal boots, thick-soled, studded, heavy to wear, and heavy to feel if slammed against a rib.
Skinhead by Richard Allen was one of the publishing success stories of 1970. It shifted over 1 million copies and led to a host of sequels by the same author. It also marked the beginning of a pulp fiction boom period for its publisher, New English Library. Few people ever knew or met Richard Allen, who until his death remained an enigmatic and mysterious figure, despite being a cult hero to skinheads all over the world. This is the story of a phenomenon in British youth publishing and the bizarre tale of its most celebrated figure.
I'm Bob Tanner, and I was the managing director of New English Library during the 60s and 70s. New English Library had not made a profit for 15 years when I went there, and we decided we'd aim at the young readership. We published big authors such as Harold Robbins, and we were looking to extend the list, so appealing not only to the mass market adult readership, but also to the younger readership.
There seemed to be this youth market out there who were interested in contemporary things that were happening, you know, not just about literary, faraway worlds, what was happening on the streets. We used to have these brainstorming sessions, the members of the editorial department, when we would see what was making the headlines in the newspapers, what people were discussing, where the young people were going, where their interests lay, and just, if you like, use that as the background and the basis for commissioning books on those subjects, which we needed to get out quickly and get on sale and catch these markets, because trends even then, you know, in pop music and whatever, were changing very quickly. So that's basically what we were looking for.
We would find authors. If we had ideas for a book at editorial meetings, we would find authors to write those books for us. Often ideas came into us from authors, but we also sought out authors to write certain books for us. At an editorial meeting, we had an idea for producing a book of something that was happening in Britain at that time, which was skinheads.
These youngsters don't reject society, they need it for steady daytime jobs. They don't want to opt out, just have their kind of fun in their own, sometimes savage way. And if you're feeling sad and want cheering up, you're never too young to become a skinhead.
You join a youth cult to belong to something. You know, it doesn't matter whether it's skinhead, mod, goth, whatever, you know, it's to belong to something. And as a kid, you're always searching for something to belong to. You're trying to find your way in life. And being a skinhead's a good way to do that. You know, you get respect from people that you probably wouldn't get otherwise. You are somebody, you know, you come off a council estate or people write you off, you're going to end up on the scrap heap. But for those few years, you are somebody. People respect you, people get out your way.
All I remember is early 70s. I suppose I was about 13, 14 years old when we first picked the Richard Allen books up.
Programme! Programme!
They were the only things like that, apart from being the blight and scrumping in the country, you know, which didn't relate to us in any ways. We didn't go to the West Country scrumping apples. We went to football, we went to Southend on away days on bank holiday. We done these kind of things. That was probably the first book I ever read at school without being bullied into it by a teacher, the skinhead books, because they were factual. They were about football, violence and the sex. That's what we wanted at 13, 14-year-old. We were right on it.
I was like 11 years old and a skinhead, and all of a sudden I sort of see these books in the shop and thought, oh, skinhead, what's all that about? And I thought, yeah, I'll have a read. Bought it, enjoyed it, bought the next one, bought the one after that, and just, that's it basically. I did read other books at the time, just any books on different cults, you know, bikers, Teddy boys, just anything to do with cults, but the skinhead books was just so true to life. I think they was just like on the street. A bit of it's sort of far-fetched, but not too much. It was as you read the book and you think that could have been me last night, you know. Come out the pub and took a bird behind the flats, and you know they was always doing that, Joe Hawkins, and then come back and had a row, and it was just so true to life, his books. Joe Hawkins was the star of the book. The book was focused on a skinhead whose name was Joe Hawkins, comes from Plaistow. He was a West Ham fan and he was an hooligan. And it's just about his life story. But he actually wasn't a real character, but at the time I myself wasn't sure. And everyone else I knew, sort of half the people said it was a true person, and the other half wasn't so sure, but no one knew if he ever existed or not.
It's a shame he's dead. I'd like to bloody meet him, Richard Allen. I'd love to talk to him.
What, just see how he got all his information?
Yeah.
If he was a skinhead in the time, or...
I thought, well, whoever wrote this book must be a skinhead himself, or must be involved in football violence, or he had to be in the know. Because the way he wrote, it was just like real life, like I said, and he must have been a thug himself. or he must have had friends who were thugs, because even if he wasn't, he thought like one in his head, so he was a secret thug.
Oh, I think they probably thought he was one of their own, and certainly the early letters that we got that were addressed to him, you know, some of which were almost illegible and others which were quite articulate and well written, were couched in such terms that they clearly thought he was one of them, you know, and they'd found this sort of sudden young cult hero who was writing about themselves and what they understood. You know, the truth, as we now know, was very different indeed.
The first job I had in writing was with the old pulp magazines. In that, we had to write at least 6 stories a week to make a decent income. What we'd do was, we'd start off with, say, Chicago on a Monday. Detective, the victim, knifed. On the Tuesday, New York. Again, possibly a detective story. May not be. But this time, the victim was shot. On the Wednesday, switch it to Los Angeles. Bring in a female, poison. By the Thursday, you're probably fed up with making it a thriller type of thing, so you switched it to a Western. And you used the same plot, except that where you had traffic in it, you had horses. On the Friday, well, maybe on the Friday, you think of something like a fantastic science fiction story. And basically, everything was the same.
He was a guy called James Moffat, who was one of the team that we had built up, who was capable of turning his hand to virtually anything. Jim was a Canadian, as I remember rightly, who'd come to this country and worked for, I think, magazines and newspapers, and turned his hand to virtually anything.
I was his agent at the time, and we had this problem, as usual, with how could he earn a bit of money and so on and so forth. And I jokingly said to him that NEL wanted a skinhead book. And he said, I'll write you a skinhead book. I said, you can't do it. It's ridiculous. He said, no, I'll do it. I mean, here we're talking about a 55-year-old man at the time who looked no more like a skinhead than Greta Garbo, but he could apply himself, which he did, and he produced his skinhead book. I took it into NEL, and they were, I don't know whether they were delighted or what, it was what they wanted, but they published it.
Oh gosh, I remember the day that I discovered Richard Allen. My older brother went to a slightly rougher school than I did, and he came home with this book called Skinhead. I think there was this myth around at the time that, look, this book is kind of banned, you know, you can't get it at W.H. Smith's or anything. So he gave it to me, and it was already a sellotaped copy that he gave to me. It got passed around my school, and by the time it got returned, you know, there was sellotape all over the place. I don't think Richard Allen would have gotten away with coming out today. Not in England anyway. In some parts of Europe where this whole sort of right-wing thing is coming up, perhaps so. But I think you have to put it in context of the times, you know. How did people speak? What was people's... Even as a black person, you know, I knew that people called you, you know, f***ing wogs or whatever they called you. And that was part of, you know, somebody else's problem, if you like. It wasn't really my problem, but that was the language of the streets. There was a lot more... verbal abuse as a foreigner in those days that you got in everyday life from white people, from English white people, than there is today. Today you sort of like probably turn back and punch somebody in the jaw. In those days it was like part of the backdrop. And in fact, I think, you know, I hate to say this today, but I think in fact, because a lot of the racism was focused against people of Asian origin. As a 12-year-old Afro-Caribbean boy in London, I didn't feel as uncomfortable with it, you know, as sort of unpolitically correct as that sounds today. It was, if it was perhaps an NF book and straight out against, blacks from Africa, the Caribbean, I'd have probably objected to it a lot more. But I don't think all skinheads were like Joe Hawkins in the book. I think you had to have a bad boy in Richard Allen's story, and there were all these obvious victims to the skinheads, such as, blacks, Asians, women, and so on. And Joe Hawkins encapsulated the ultimate, bad boy hero.
Joe felt his boot sink deep into the tall one's groin. He lashed out again, catching the other under the chin as he sank to the ground, hands clutching the injured parts. Like an automaton, Joe kept kicking, each blow bringing him greater satisfaction as the moans of hurt rose above the screaming wind. He didn't care if he killed the hippie or not. He wanted to hurt, to rid himself of the feeling within his chest, a feeling bordering on murderous rage. Don laughed, slammed his shortened axe handle almost down the hippie's throat as the man valiantly tried to resist. It was easy, Don thought, kicking his opponent in the balls, listening to the rapturous sigh and the explosive groan. He hit the falling hippie on the head, hearing the crunch of bone against the axe handle, and kicked into the ribs.
I was teaching in the early 1970s at Dainford School in East London, which was an all-boys school, and had about it, as the whole of Bethnal Green did, this mythology and this atmosphere of mystery and violence and wonder. And in a sense, I was beginning to work with those youth who adopted the skinhead style. My problem was, as a teacher, we had children who were disaffected and alienated, and we had to teach them. And I was a teacher of English, and we had to find ways of talking to them and working through them in literature. I found this book called Skinhead that was being read around the school, around my particular class. There were 2 or 3 copies of it, and they were reading it avidly. This in a class that I was supposed to be doing C.S. Forrester's The Gun with, which is a worthy book in its own right, but really and truthfully it was a bit like walking through treacle. Yet here they were with Skinhead, reading it of their own volition, of their own interest. Kids who didn't dress like skinheads, who weren't skinheads, still found it an enormously exciting and interesting book. And I read it. I borrowed a copy, confiscated a copy, and read it. I decided that it might be quite useful. In fact, let me be honest, I thought it would be very useful to try and use an extract from Allen's novel in the class. It took a bit of time finding a good extract. I didn't want anything that had racism, I didn't want anything that just had casual violence, which made it hard going for me. But all the class, those who adopted a skinhead style, those who'd got their hair long and were moving into what you and I might call the hippies, all of them, it created this frisson, this atmosphere, this sense of interest and bubbling enjoyment that I'd never been able to create before. I just couldn't. And the literature that I loved, and even my enthusiasm for it, couldn't create that sense of interest that those stick-down, badly photocopied pages did.
Jim Moffat probably remained blissfully unaware that his books had become an educational tool, as he spent most of his time not in the East End of London, where they were set, but in Sidmouth, where he lived in a seafront cottage far removed from Joe Hawkins' squalor. A voracious writer throughout this period, Moffat veered between skinhead tales, detective and spy novels, and even a regular column for the local paper, the Sidmouth Herald, where he would chat about local issues and events that bothered him. Throughout this time, he lived with his wife, Derry, who saw the popularity of the skinhead novels rise and rise, much to the author's amazement.
He did a bit of research, and he travelled around a bit and asked a lot of questions, and wrote the first book. And of course, he didn't think too much about it, but it was a success. And then there was such a follow-up with Suede Heads and Skin Girls. I can't remember all the titles. I believe there were 18 of them in the end. But he took to it, And I won't say to begin with it was his favourite subject, because he wrote on so many other things. But he got on with it. It did well for him from the point of view of cash and royalties. And I think it also did very, very well for New English Library.
These are some of the 250 books I've written in 20 years. In the past year, I've written 8, 9 books, mostly due to the fact that I haven't been too well this year. In this rack, books under various names, under my own name, under Charles Say, under Richard Allen. Richard Allen, well, this was a name actually that I didn't even choose. This was a name that the publishers put on the book. Occasionally it happens that you let the publishers pick the name. One book coming out this year will be under the name of Francis Duke. I didn't even know until 2 weeks ago that this name was going on the book. You take Skinhead. This was written within 5-6 days. Skinhead has sold over 165,000 copies to date.
It was phenomenal, really, the way he used to produce books. But it was unfortunate in a way that he had to do that, because given time, he could write quite decent stuff. But I think it was the old case of prostituting oneself or one's profession. But there we are. It's like anybody else. You've got to earn a living, and if your living or your style of living is an expensive one, you've got to work that much harder.
Jim used to say, "It's a business. It's the way I make my money, and I can live this way." I mean, people who write hardbacks can take a very, very long time to write them, which is very nice if you've got a good income behind you. Jim didn't have. I mean, he simply wrote to live, and he enjoyed doing it.
I like to sit down in front of a typewriter, start writing from the title. Play it by that. The title gives me the idea, it gives me the whole germ of the story, and I continue it right through.
How many words a day do you get through?
On an average, I get through about 10,000 words a day when I'm meeting a deadline. If I have a month to write a book in, I may get through 500, 1,000 words a day until the last week. Then I shoot up to the 10,000.
Do you ever go back and rewrite stuff?
I never go back and rewrite. I don't believe in editing. I don't even believe in reading more than 2 pages on the following day. This, I believe, a professional writer should have the story in his head. Even if he's doing 2, 3 stories at the one time, he should keep all story threads in his head.
Skinheads were in no way the only cult celebrated by New English Library. Novels on everything from groupies to satanic sex were soon raking in the cash, and teenagers all over the country were lapping them up. Hot on the heels of Richard Allen came a whole host of paperbacks about the skinhead arch-rivals, the Hells Angels, and biker books like Peter Cave's bestseller Chopper found their way into the homes of every motorbike enthusiast.
I've been in the Hells Angels now for nearly 20 years, and it's kind of difficult to explain probably why I've been there 20 years, but it's for me, it's a total way of life. To me, the Hells Angels is the #1 worldwide motorcycle club, and for people who are, as I hope I am, seriously into motorcycles, they were the people I got involved with in the early days, and they're the people I've stuck with. riding motorcycles is about the most exciting thing that I've ever done, and I've dedicated most of my life to it. I read lots of books, but none of that is a substitute for riding a bike. I had a bike all the time through the 60s, and it seemed to me that there was absolutely nothing that reflected the concerns of people like me. I mean, I'm a working class kid. I was born and brought up in South East London, and everything on the media was like students, LSE was up in arms, the Vietnam War protests, all very good stuff. But insofar as every day on the street was concerned, there was nothing in any way to do with us. And then these books came out, and okay, I mean, in hindsight, they're extremely far-fetched, but at the time, they actually related to the kinds of things we were doing. And I suppose it was very gratifying that someone actually took notice. When you read those books now and take the laughable bits away, the factual elements of it regarding biking and the cultural elements of it are really quite accurate. I imagine that Peter Cave had some kind of intimate knowledge of it. I mean, we thought for a long time that Peter Cave is somebody who we might know and you might meet in a pub and actually goes off and lives somewhere like Hampstead and does this writing on the side and makes a lot of money out of it. And it was a very intriguing thing. I guess you lose the interest after a few years. I mean, I know that there's renewed interest now, but I still don't know who he is.
They were crazy times. The whole period, you know, the late 60s, early 70s, it was all very much like this. You know, oh, hey, let's go and do something. Let's have a go. Let's try something. I was at the time editing a series of men's magazines, girly magazines, called Flirt and Skirt, believe it or not. And I happened to be at a party in Notting Hill one night, and literally this woman came up to me and she says, "Oh, you're a writer." And I said, "Well, yes, I'm a writer. Do you fancy writing a book?" So I said, "Yes, I fancy writing a book." And she said, "Fine, phone me in the morning." Well, this was Janet Freer, who became my agent. She was, and she literally, within a week, had tied me up to a contract at NEL. And they said, "Well, we want a Hells Angel book. Do you know anything about the Hells Angels?" And I said, "Well, I used to ride a motorbike." "Oh, that's right, fine, we'll bluff it through." And literally, within a couple of weeks, I'd signed a contract to write Chopper, which I did. I didn't actually know how successful it was, probably for about 4 or 5 months afterward. Then suddenly, I got letters saying we're going to reprint. And then it was reprinted again. And then suddenly, NEL are onto me saying, "We've got to have a follow-up, we've got to have another one." And yeah, at which point I learned that, in fact, it went on to 7 reprints. And was sold all over the world. It went into various translators in Sweden, Denmark, Italy. It went to all sorts of odd places. I think it even went to South Africa, of all places. And then suddenly, then I knew that the Hells Angel books and the Skinhead books were just selling like hotcakes, and everybody, not necessarily bikers, everybody seemed to have a copy of Chopper. It was really odd.
Action was where Chopper Harris belonged. Like a moth to a naked electric light bulb or a junkie to his nearest fix, a Hells Angel always gravitated towards the nearest possible fight or the quickest possible sex, or to somewhere an angel could do something to prove himself one better than an ordinary pig citizen. Chopper throttled back, causing the engine to belch out a loud backfire from the supercharged carburettor. He pulled into the curb, jammed the heavy bike against the pavement and dismounted to make the necessary preparations for whatever the night held in store.
I got hate mail. I got a death threat from Pentonville Prison. And I had this character called Big Bad Ben, who literally took to phoning me up about sort of 3 o'clock in the morning and sort of saying, "We're coming to get you. You've been taking the Hells Angels' name in vain, mate, and we're going to nail you to a tree." And at that point I went ex-directory because I was starting to get a bit worried this. And yeah, it stopped after that. But I think they did have a point. I mean, they were trying to take themselves seriously as a subculture. And here was, you know, overtly exploitative book, you know, fictionalizing their lives when they were taking themselves seriously.
Certainly was opportunist publishing, one wouldn't deny that for a moment, but we were looking for markets that existed, and these books were reflecting what was happening on the streets. I mean, I've drawn comparisons in the past, which I hope people won't feel are pretentious, but Dickens, for instance, wrote his works which reflected what was going on in an area of society as serial stories. Never let's lose track of that. Harold Robbins, who we also published at New English Library extremely successfully, wrote about a different strata of society, in other words, the film business and so on in the States. The skinhead books, the motorcycle books, and so on, were also reflecting an area of society that was happening in England. They were unpretentious, they didn't set out to be literary, but they did represent what was happening, and the people in them were believable. And I think that's why they were so successful. They had no pretensions, they were good stories about people that everybody recognised, and certainly the younger generation bought them by the bucket load.
Among the avid buyers of NEL's output in the 70s was trash movie enthusiast Nigel Wingrove, now responsible for the revival of interest in Peter Cave and some of the period's other writers.
When I started Redemption, which is my film distribution company, where we're distributing, if you like, 70s sex and horror films, when I was home a couple of years ago, I sort of dug these out, and I sort of have fond memories of them and brought them back up to London. I like the covers, just like the feel of them, and I was looking at them and I decided I'd love to republish some of these, particularly the Hell's Angel ones and some of the horror ones, because I read those, those particular titles when I was at school. I still find it kind of difficult to believe that I've ended up publishing something like Chopper, which I read at school. It was kind of one of the ones that nearly all my friends read, and this one and Skinhead were the two kind of definitive youth books, I think, around this in the early 70s. And I sort of went through them, and this is one of the ones I wanted to pick up, and I couldn't believe it when we actually got the rights to it, and have now republished it.
Oh, Paul.
Yeah, this is the youth sort of target that I'm trying to attract to read these books. I'm much more used to seeing things visual now, so although you can't create a visual book, I mean, unless you make a film, but I can go at least some of the way towards that by creating stills that hopefully will attract people to it, and then lead them in to read the book to see what it's about. And obviously I can glamorise the stills to an extent, but I do try to keep them close to scenes in the book. I don't fabricate scenes when they are related to scenes in the book. Well, we're shooting pictures for Daughters of Satan by Sandra Shulman. We're going to be publishing this one and another one of her books, The Degenerate. So again, it ties in because I want a mishmash of sex, horror, drugs, violence. I mean, the same as our films, but these are my novel nasties, if you like.
So get something like that, sit there.
I actually couldn't believe that somebody wanted to republish The Daughters of Satan, which I'd written for New English Library, partly because the publisher had read it at school, and I was slightly horrified. I thought it must have stunted his growth. It couldn't have been good for him.
Good.
The first book I had published was The Degenerates.
That's it there, terrific.
It was very loosely based on the Profumo scandal, but it had a black magic twist.
Good.
Originally, when I put up the idea to them, they doubted that I could write what I said I wanted to write, and someone said, would I do an orgy scene as a first sample chapter? Well, I'll tell you exactly how I did it, and not the orgying bit, but how I did it. I sat down and listed as many possible perversions as I could. There was even one involving somebody of, I think we say today, diminished height. And having come up with a shopping list of perversions and possible, I choreographed them into, so that until I got the right amount of words, and until I'd made it look, what shall I say, I'd made a scene. I wasn't frankly sure what shafting was at the time, and I did have some problem with my American editor, who was a woman, and I went out to dinner with her, a male editor, and her husband. And it suddenly appeared that I didn't quite understand what going down on meant. And I kept saying quite loudly in the restaurant, well, what does going down on mean? Because it sounds terribly innocent. And the men were immensely, but immensely embarrassed. And I'm afraid she had to take me outside and explain. I don't regret it. It was an experience, and after all, experience goes into being what you're made of. It was enormous fun. It's probably more fun looking back because there was terrible angst, and one, you know, had heightened emotion and felt very tantrumy about one's work. But it was fun. I don't regret it. I think it's silly to regret things anyway. They're part of you.
By 1974, New English Library were the market leaders in pulp paperbacks. But the skinhead audience was beginning to thin out. Having put Joe Hawkins in prison and even sent him to Australia, that year Richard Allen made a bold move and decided to kill off the reader's hero once and for all.
The BBC carried the first news and the Globe managed to change its front page for the final edition. London-bound jet missing in Pacific. Fears mounted today for the safety of passengers aboard an Australian London jet missing after an emergency call over Indonesia. Rescue helicopters are said to be searching a wide area, mostly tropical jungle, without much hope of finding survivors. According to the airport authorities, there are 189 passengers on the flight, most former Britons coming back home for a holiday. Also known to be on board is Chief Superintendent Matthew Jordan of Scotland Yard, who was escorting the skinhead cop killer, Joe Hawkins, back to prison in this country. Lottie Newman read the paper's account of the missing aircraft and suppressed a sob. Although she'd wished every horrible fate on Joe Hawkins, she did not like to think of anybody, even him, dying in a crash.
Things changed midway through the 70s, probably towards the end of the 70s. There was a change, there was a new generation. Every 10 years there's a new generation. There's a new generation coming along. And Jim had run out of the ideas of skinheads. I think Jim had run out of ideas for skinheads. And I don't think we could find more material for him to work on. But Jim had earned quite a bit of money, and it would be wrong to say he got lazy, but I think he became less inclined for a while to write anymore. He just disappeared from the scene for a while. It was rather sad, really, because I think we always paid up front to these authors. We gave them advance to go out and write the book. And Jim was paid up front for certain books, and he just didn't return. So we rather lost contact with Jim for a while. But he was drinking away his earnings. I think that's what happened. I think that his money that he'd earned, he went on alcohol.
I'd contracted a book for him, but because of a domestic situation or as a money situation, he disappeared and I couldn't find him. Weeks went by and then he suddenly turned up out of the blue. And he came in smart as ever, but he admitted to me that, you know, he hadn't written it and so on. I said, well, look, I've got a spare room in my office. You'll have to write it in there, and I want it fast. I locked him in this, not locked him, but when I went out in the evening to go home, I had to lock him in the building. And I used to buy him a quart of light ale, which I knew he could never get drunk on anyway, and he used to sit there and type it out, which he did for, I think, it was also a home to him. He sat there for about 10 days, 2 weeks, and he produced the book. And I delivered it to NEL, and it was published. But that was a bad time for him, very, very bad time, and it did him an awful lot of damage.
When he left writing for New English Library, he didn't write as much because there wasn't the call for it, and he had to battle around to find markets. They got a different editor in who I think, from what I gather, wanted to change New English Library image, and so therefore he was not encouraging to Jim as far as work was concerned, and Jim started to look elsewhere.
The days of the skinhead novel were over. Richard Allen made a move into the teeny bop market with glam and tried to keep up with punk rock, but wrote little else after. The books went quickly out of print, just as a whole skinhead revival began, with two-tone and bands like Madness and the Specials. Suddenly, these cheap books were collectible property, and fashionable magazines like The Face and ID started writing about Allen. James Moffat's writing days had all but ended, yet he had now become a huge pop culture hero.
It does seem to have become a cult. I've gone to book fairs, which happen once a month in Tewkesbury at a hotel. They have a very good book fair. And I ask all these different dealers, you know, have you any paperbacks? And I reel off a few of Jim's names. They just haven't got them because they're so snapped up. And when I went into a bookshop in Cheltenham last year, and asked if there were any Richard Allen books or any books at all, James Moffat, etc. The woman said there isn't a thing in the shop. She did tell me that a man had come into the shop some months earlier and that he had spent practically a day in her shop, which has thousands of books in it, going all through them, and he was obviously looking for anything at all that had been written by Jim. I don't know who that person was. I have an idea, but I'm not sure.
I read the Richard Allen books when I was at school under the desk. As I got a bit older, I started reading, you know, Alan Rope Grier and William Burroughs and who knows what else, and all sorts of other things. So I've been reading much more experimental fiction for a long time, and then I was just on holiday in Devon in 1984, and I needed something to read, and there was just a small town with a charity shop, no second-hand bookshop, no new bookshop. So I went in the charity shop, and there on the spinning round rack of cheapo books was a 10p copy of Boot Boy. So I looked at it, thought, I remember reading that, I'll get this. And at that time, they were it was easy to find them second-hand. You just find them for 10p, no one was really interested. And the stuff that I couldn't find, I was going in the British Library to read. I would actually go in there and read 6 in a day, so I'd sit at the desk and read my 6 New English Library books. What you'd find was there'd be a lot of repetition between the books. I mean, sentences and paragraphs would be reused. I mean, not just Richard Allen and the Peter Cave, the same thing. I really liked the effect this had, so I started reading them as works of experimental fiction rather than as pulp. I decided I wanted to, you know, write experimental fiction in this style. For a long time I didn't know how to get hold of him, and then everyone got hold of Richard Allen after an interview appeared in Scootering magazine. I'm not sure how the guy tracked him down for scootering, but somehow he tracked him down. The first letter back was saying, if your next letter is to my satisfaction, then I'll give you my home address and you can write to me with ease. And I think I said in the first letter I sent him that, you know, I read his books when I was a kid and I still really liked them, and I probably mentioned that I had a book or two published. So he was very keen for me to find him a publishing deal. He wanted the Skinhead books republished as omnibuses. Well, I looked at a couple of places and asked a few people if they were interested, but no one was very interested. I mean, the kind of right-wing aspect being very off-putting for most people. And I also don't think a lot of the people I talked to realised quite what commercial proposition they were. When George Marshall came along, Jim was very, very happy with that. You know, he was pleased. I don't think he got much money up front, but he was just very happy to be republished.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard DC 10 Flight 1313. We will be cruising at a height of 25,000 feet and airspeed of 600
By a pleasing symmetry, the Richard Allen books, which had been written in an English seaside town, were finally picked up by a small publisher in a Scottish seaside town, Dunoon. Dunoon had been the home of Skinhead Times, the cult's in-house magazine, and its editor, George Marshall, could hardly believe his luck when Moffat sold him the rights and gave the go-ahead for him to republish.
The Skinhead cult has been really important to me over the years, and I've tried to give as much back to it as possible. And, you know, they're the ultimate books. For any youth cult, they're the ultimate books. I always wanted the rights. I even went to Malta on holiday because I was told that there was a lot of the old books were still on sale there, so I assumed they must have been remaindered and dumped in Malta for some reason. And I spent a whole holiday going around every little second-hand bookshop I could find, and I didn't find one copy, because I was hoping to sell, you know, the second-hand copies of the original editions. So I always wanted them, and probably I was looking harder than anybody else. I think he was really pleased that these books were going to come back out. And I also think he thought it was quite good that he was giving something back to a cult that had given him so much over the years. I never met Richard Allen because by the time I, you know, caught up with him, he was quite ill, and you know, I never actually got to meet him because of that. And all our correspondence was through the post. He'd write to me maybe 2 or 3 times a week, you know, just generally about life, you know, often nothing particular, you know, just what he was doing, you know, feeding foxes that came into his garden. Going down town, chasing hippies, you know, just sort of like old men do. So one of the times he wrote, and he had seen some hippies down some market, and he had told them to get a job, you know, and he was quite pleased with that, as was I. But yeah, he used to love writing, I suppose, and that's how he kept in touch with people.
He died, as you probably know, with cancer. And he had been, in his younger years, a very attractive looking man with the bluest eyes I've ever seen. Very, very blue eyes, because of course he came from Irish stock. And I think they're noted, some of them, for their good looks and their very blue eyes. But he became very, very weak. He lost a lot of weight. He loved to smoke, and there was no way he was going to give up his cigarettes, and there was no way he wanted chemotherapy or to have anything done to his body. He said he would go out his way. And for the last couple of years of his life, he was a very ill man, and he did actually drop down to about 6 stone, I think, from 14 stone. He was cremated, and I wanted to have the ashes. I kept the ashes, his last packet of cigarettes, partly smoked, the little ashtray, which was his favourite one, just a few of his favourite things, and I have them in the house here with me. I still do find it very emotional, very distressing, because we had a lot in common, and I still do miss him very, very much. But it does give me a sense of comfort to feel that his ashes are here in the house with me, and they always will be, wherever I live, wherever I go, until I, too, am ashes.
When I read all the Skinhead books and the Suede Head and all that, I thought, you know, I'll keep them forever, because it was my era, you know. It was all about me and my mates. No, I wouldn't sell them now. I was told they were £30 each now, but I still wouldn't sell them because it's, you know, they're sort of my sentimental value now. No, if you said I'll give you 30 quid for them each, I mean, I've got about 14 of them, I wouldn't. I'll keep them.
It's good.